everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Shaukat, and we are going to have a conversation with Mr. Ali Mahmood about his latest book called The Muslims. Well, let's try now. Yeah? Okay. So, as I said, my name is Shaukat. We are going to have a conversation with Mr. Ali Mahmood about his latest book called The Muslims. This is not his first book. He had a previous book called Saints and Sinners, which talked about why some countries grew rich and others don't. Perhaps we could take some lessons from that book as to fix things in Pakistan, but that's a different issue. So I want to introduce, say a little bit about Mr. Mahmood. He comes from a noble family, and that I define as those families which supported Jinnah and the Pakistan movement very, very strongly and were keystones to getting us this country where we are now enjoying ourselves. So Ali was born in a very important house. He has had a privileged life. He has traveled. He has had adventures. I'm not going to go into them, but he also has turned to entrepreneurship, and that's always amazing to me when these such families who have grown up in a particular way revert to fighting in this space for business. So you have done very well in business, and then with all that you decided to write a book. So the first one was 2014, if I'm not mistaken. So so I'd say welcome to you, but I would like to know from you, why did you suddenly decide to, was it sudden or were you already working on it? Did you have it in mind? Everybody wants to make a film, open a restaurant, write a book. These are three basic things that everybody wants to do. So where are you in that?
Well, I never wanted to make a film.
That's good.
I think writing a book came from a conversation I had long ago with many years ago, when I was 17 years old. I landed up at a dinner with Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan. He was 70 years old, I was 17 years old. And everyone was carrying on about what a great and brilliant person he was. So I turned to him and I said, "Sir, can you tell me something which will be of use to me in my life?" So he thought for a moment, and he said that you can have so much money that you can't spend it, so much food you can't eat it, so much wine you can't drink it. But the one thing you'll always be short of is time. And finally, your life is about how you use your time and what you create with your time. So from that day on, I realized the value of time, and I try to use time. I have the unfortunate habit that I wake up very early. I always have, 4 o'clock, 4:30. And when no one else is around, you can either watch the TV or you can read and write. I chose to read and write. So that is how I started writing my first book.
Fantastic. So I want to say that this book that you have written is an extraordinary book. I say that genuinely, seriously, not because the LLF asked me to say these things. Sorry? ये बड़ा मुश्किल हो गया. Okay. हाँ. मैं ये कह रहा था कि I have read this book. No, it's okay. I think we'll manage. Thank you very much. I find this book a tremendous book. Okay. LLF didn't ask me to say that, but I say that from my own behalf. I enjoyed reading it. It's a tremendous summation of the Islamic history, whether you call it civilization, religion, everything put together. It's a fantastic summary of all these 1,000 years or so. Now, it is not a lightweight book. It's 2 kilos or something like that. So the weight also corresponds with the weighty information that is contained in the book. And since when you met Chaudhry Zafrullah Khan when he was 70, you are meeting me when I am 72 or 74. I don't know. I still think that after all those years and after having read so many things about Islam, Pakistan, I find a lot of stuff here that took me by surprise. And we'll talk about those surprises later on. But it's fascinating to me, so I want to congratulate you because this book, certainly you must have spent many years in putting all this together. It's very well researched and there are a lot of anecdotes and some of those anecdotes, I like history with anecdotes, otherwise it becomes very dry. So it's rich with anecdotes, side history, side stories. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book and then we'll take it from there.
In the first instance, the book is about the story of these people, and the story starts with the life of the Prophet. When he left Makkah, there were not even 100 Muslims in the world. And within 100 years, they ruled all the land from the Atlantic Ocean to China. And didn't just rule, they led the world in science, medicine, culture, commerce, architecture, in everything. So what I started looking for was what was it that took the Muslims up and made them world leaders. And this empire of the Muslims lasted 1,000 years, the biggest land empire the world has ever seen, and 1,000 years it carried on from strength to strength, from achievement to achievement. And then, exactly 1,000 years after it started, the whole thing imploded. And the Muslims ceased to lead the world. The West rose. The West overtook the Muslims, in places conquered the Muslims, and the new masters of the universe were from Europe, from Britain, even a little later from Japan. But the Muslims fell to becoming the dregs of the world. So again I asked myself, not just what took them up, but what made them come down, what broke them, what crashed them, and what took the British up, what took the Europeans up, what took the West up. For 200 years, the West ruled and dominated the world. But then their greed caught up with them. And in the 20th century, the First World War, the Second World War, the death of over 100 million people in wars smashed the will of the West to continue ruling the world. New countries were born, and you start to see a re-emergence of the Muslim people. It wasn't an easy struggle. It started with Ataturk for the first time beating British or European army, a white man's army. It moves on to Mossadegh, who nationalized England's Anglo-Iranian oil company, which was the greatest and biggest asset that Britain held anywhere in the world. It led to Nasser taking over the Suez Canal. It finally led to Gaddafi and King Faisal and their oil embargo on the West. It led to the rise of the Taliban, the Mujahideen, the wars against Russia. So suddenly the Muslims, who are certainly nowhere at the top, but they're not as helplessly at the bottom that they once were. So what I tried to learn about, understand, and then write about was what took them up, what took them down, where are we today, and is there any chance that we're going up again rather than down? So this is what the book is about.
Yeah. There is on the title, on the cover of the book, there is this words written in Arabic. So I asked a number of people if they could read these words to let me know what they were, because they were not in a regular script that we are taught at our madrasas or schools or whatever it is. And hardly anybody could explain that to me. Eventually I found somebody who had worked in Saudi Arabia and supported a beard. He was able to tell me about it. So what it says is welfare society has to be based on justice and knowledge. So this book is, if I may say so, very much based on your evaluation about the values, what great values Islam proposed and pushed forward, which were justice and knowledge. What are, your summation of these values?
I think the four crucial differences that emerged among the early Muslims was, and they were all guided by the Prophet's putting values into them. Number one, knowledge. Seek knowledge. I mean, we've all heard go unto China, even unto China, to seek knowledge. But a couple of quotes of the Prophet are worth mentioning. The ink of the scholar is more holy than the blood of the martyr. 1 hour's meditation of the work of the Creator is better than 70 years of prayer. So it started with his clear direction that this was important. Today, you all hear and talk and think about the great universities of the world, Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Yale, now even Beijing is joining these ranks. But at that time, the top universities of the world were Beth al-Hikmat in Baghdad, started by Harun al-Rashid and his son Mamun. The Dar al-Hikmat in Cordoba, started by the Umayyads in Spain. Al-Azhar in Cairo, started by the Fatimids. So the top universities were the Muslim creations, and the people who were prominent in these universities were not treated as people of no respect. They were given extreme value. You take Hunayn bin Ishaq, who was the top translator in Baghdad, responsible for taking the knowledge of the Greeks and bringing it into Arabic, from where it went later into Latin and the European languages. Whenever he did a book, the Caliph rewarded him with gold equal to the weight of the book. So he was earning a lot more money than a typical businessman by writing.
Don't mind that, doing that with Muslims.
So you then got, in medicine, the famous Ibn Sina or Avicenna. I think any of us who have been to the Arab countries or worked in the Arab countries, on every street corner there's an Ibn Sina pharmacy. Who was this Ibn Sina? He was a young man who, by the age of 10, was a Hafiz-e-Quran. When he was a young teenager, he cured the Khalifa of an illness which defied everybody else. Nobody could work out how to deal with it. He then started producing drugs. I think he was a one-man equivalent to Beecham or SmithKline today, or Roche. And he produced 700 drugs before he died. Drugs which spread the world and were
700 different drugs.
And he also had much admiration for Aristotle. By the time he was 20, he could recite Aristotle's metaphysics by heart. So, these were the type of people who were famous in the Muslim world. And I think at that time, the libraries of the caliphs, both in Cordoba and in Baghdad, ran to over 500,000 books. At that time, the biggest library in Europe was 600 books. And you can see the discrepancy. I think that they were also very tolerant of other religions. And there's this lovely story in Spain where the ruler was a Muslim. But a smaller king, a neighbor king, was known as Sancho. And Sancho's problem was he loved to eat. And he ate so much that he became known as Sancho the Fat. And he became so fat that his people said it's not right for us to have such a so fat ruler. So they threw him out. They said, you go and we'll find a ruler who is less fat. So where did he go? He went to the Muslim ruler and said, you've got a very famous doctor who's a Jewish man by the name of Shaprut. And he said that, can you get him to slim me down? So the Muslim ruler said, fine. put him up as a guest in the palace, and he took several months at it. But at the end of those maths, I think that this Sancho was slim as an actor, I think almost like Sardar Asif has become now.
MashaAllah.
But so here you have an example of a Christian ruler being treated by a Jewish doctor in the court or the palace of a Muslim king. So I think that one of the other stories of the Muslims' position in the world of science and knowledge really fascinated me, because I was brought up in the West where I was told that there was this amazing man, Leonardo da Vinci. And I was told not only he was a great artist, but his scientific discoveries, nobody could compete. I was told that he designed flight and was the first man to design flight. But when I started reading about the past and the Muslim past, I learned that 600 years before the birth of Leonardo, there was a Muslim scientist born in Cordoba by the name of Ibn Firnas. And Ibn Firnas went to see a stuntman try to fly by jumping off a building. It didn't work. The stuntman crashed and started laughing. Everybody clapped and laughed, and that was the end of that. But not for Ibn Firnas. Ibn Firnas went home and started to study flight. He was 43 years old at that time, and for the next 27 years he studied flight on his own. At the age of 70, he called out the people of Cordoba and said, "I will show you flight." And he strapped a contraction on his back wings, and he jumped from a cliff. And he flew out 2 miles, flew back, for 10 minutes flew around in circles, and then yelled down to the people that I'm coming down to land, and started to come down to land. But he started coming down very fast. And he said, "Oh God, I've made a mistake, forgive me. I forgot the tail." Because he was studying birds, and birds have a tail which they put down when they're landing.
Right.
So he crashed. But he didn't die. He broke some of his ribs, and he carried on. He was cured. He was made back into health. And he lived another 12 years, always begging God's forgiveness for being so arrogant that he forgot the wings. But he was the actual man who discovered flight, not Leonardo, who 600 years later did some drawings on papers but never even attempted to fly. So these and so many others.
Just on that point, isn't there in the Greek mythology Icarus who also built wings and got too close to the sun and the wings melted?
I think definitely. And unfortunately, his wings melted and he fell. But that was mythology, and this is reality.
Okay.
So I think that we need to recognize the importance of the Muslim scientists at that time and their great achievement, which has been totally... I read a lovely book about all this Muslim science of the medieval ages, and the book was called The Lost History, because everything has been lost. And today, Europe claims all these discoveries. You take today, you are having computers, you're having all this modern technology, communication, silicon, but none of this would have been possible without Al-Khwarizmi and his simple putting the zero into the calculation. Without the zero, none of this works. So much of what's happening today was created by these people almost 1,000 years ago. So knowledge, I think, is a very exciting part of what the Muslims did. And while all this was going on, the great Charlemagne, the king of Europe, which is celebrated, he was also pursuing knowledge. He was learning to sign his name. He never knew how to read and write. So this was the difference between Europe and the countries of the Muslims. When Paris, when London was slums of 25,000 people, where they threw slop out on your head in the streets, and if you got illness, you were chased out of the town. At that time, Cordoba, Baghdad, they had street lighting, they had public baths, they even had hospitals. So there was a lot of difference, and knowledge led to that difference.
the reproduction of books was by people writing by hand. Printing press had not yet come in. And yet these libraries were destroyed by the hordes who came in from the steppes of Central Asia.
I'm rather fond of the hordes, so I wouldn't put all the blame on them, but we can come to that.
Ah, okay.
But I think that moving on beyond knowledge,
Ji.
the next value which was crucial in changing Muslim society was justice. The Muslims believed in justice far more than any other people in the world. The Prophet was placed a great emphasis on justice. And when you, shortly after his death, look at Hazrat Umar. When he became Khalifa, his son was brought to him, drunk, and having fooled around with some girls under the influence of alcohol. He said the punishment is lashing, 80 lashes. And they lashed him and he said, make it hard. The boy died under the lashes. So Hazrat Umar had his own son lashed to death in the pursuit of justice. Moving into more modern times, the great Sher Shah Suri, who I think we all have a certain affinity with, he was a great believer in justice, and once a week he had a open kacheri, and anyone with a complaint could come and the ruler, Sher Shah, would give his justice. Well, one day a Hindu merchant comes to him and says, sir, I have a complaint. He said, tell me about it. He says, my wife was having a bath behind the wall of our compound, and your son came by on his elephant, looked down over the wall at her bathing, winked at her and threw her a pan. And she's so embarrassed she wants to commit suicide. So the Sher Shah called his son and said, did you actually do this? So he said, yes, Dad, I did. So he thought for a moment and then he pronounced judgment. I think that it's amazing the judgment he pronounced. He told him, you give your elephant to the merchant, tell your wife to go and have a bath, and give him a pan and he will climb on the elephant, wink at your wife and throw her a pan. Now compare that with the sons of the elite today and their Ferraris and their Rolls Royces. The laws don't apply to them, but in those days the laws applied to everybody. I think that what was the effect of this emphasis on justice? I would just like to give two quotations. One from Al-Ghazali in his advice for kings. He says, religion depends on monarchy. Monarchy on the army on suppliers, the suppliers on prosperity, and prosperity on justice. Again, a great philosopher, Kutak Bilig, who used to advise the early Turkish rulers, said, to control the state requires a large army. To support the troops requires great wealth. To obtain this wealth, the people must be prosperous. For the people to be prosperous, the laws must be just. If any one of these neglected, the state will collapse. So, even the man who I would say was one of the greatest Muslims over this 1500 years, Taimur or Tamerlane the Conqueror, on his deathbed he advised his grandson, make justice the guide of all your actions, and the empire will long remain in your hands. I think that when we see the Islamic empire imploding, the loss of justice, the death of justice played a very big part. And even today, if you want to try to recreate a country which you can be proud of and the world can admire, without justice it just can't be done.
So you think justice is the cornerstone of building a society, and then other things come in. If you have justice, then you have knowledge, etc., good governance.
You can do very well with just justice, just as you could win a race by running on one leg. But to win on two legs is better than winning on one leg. And in this case, there are four legs. There's education, there's justice, and there's merit. The next thing is merit.
So tell us about merit.
Societies, when they're stagnating, tend to be guided by status. If your father was a big man, then you deserve to be a big man. In the time of the Muslims, early Muslims, merit became more important than status, which is why so many slaves, who obviously had no status, became people of great significance in the early Islamic world. You take Iltamash, who was a slave, but he became the son-in-law of Qutbuddin Aibak because of his capability. You take the Mamluks of Egypt, who were a slave dynasty, slaves who took empire and kept empire, who ruled. You take the Ottomans, their janissaries, and their practice of going out every year and taking young Christian boys and bringing them up in special schools till these boys became the rulers, the prime ministers. And you take the greatest Ottoman emperor, who I think all of you have been watching on TV, Suleiman the Magnificent, and his story of his wife Khurram, who was also a slave, who became queen. But he had three great prime ministers in his time and that of his son. The first was Ibrahim, who was prime minister for 13 years, a slave who became his best friend and became the most powerful and important man in the land. After that, you had Rustam Pasha, who... Okay. Is this okay? Okay. You have Rustam Pasha, who was married to the daughter of Suleiman. You take Sokoli, the third great prime minister, who was married to Suleiman's son, Salim. The son was a drunkard known as Salim the Sot, because he was always drunk. But the empire continued okay because Sokoli, his prime minister, was brilliant. So these prime ministers in the Ottoman times and all over, they were people who rose from the ranks. I think I was chatting for a few minutes to Sayyid Babar Ali in the other room, and he was saying with what pride that we give scholarships to boys of merit and what some of them have become. I was talking a few days ago in Karachi to one of the Habibs who have created this new university, Habib University. And they were telling me about a man, he's about my age now, but when he joined their school, he was from Liari in Karachi. He couldn't afford the 5 rupee fee. So he was put through as a scholar. And he didn't know Urdu and he didn't know English. He only knew Gujarati and whatever, Brohi and the languages of Liari. Today, he's a billionaire with offices in Singapore, Europe, and America. And he produces some of the highest technology for Boeing aircraft, so for stealth flights, etc. So here's what can be done when merit replaces status as the root to everything. And I think there's a beautiful story about a slave girl called Ya Wadud in the time of Harun al-Rashid. And he purchased her for the huge amount of 100,000 dinars, not dirhams, dinars. I think this is either 1 or 5 or $10 million today. And why did he pay so much for her? Because this particular slave girl was not just a looker. She also passed exams with merit in medicine, law, astronomy, philosophy, music, mathematics, poetry, history, and the Quran. Now, if a slave girl could become an expert at all this, you can imagine the emphasis based on merit.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe they don't make them like that anymore. And the problem is that the relationship between
Are you referring to slave girls or merit?
both. The relationship between the slave and the master in our period that we cover, was it different from that meted out by the Europeans who also had slaves, or we applied certain other principles to that?
You know, if you were a slave in America, you couldn't be anything but a slave. The best you could be is an Uncle Tom, who is allowed in the house and allowed to eat the scraps. If you were a Muslim slave, you could marry the son or daughter of a king. You could rise to any height. And I think the different attitude towards slavery is when Faisal, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, went to America on one of the state visits to negotiate. He was staying at the Waldorf Astoria, and he had his slaves with him. And his slaves were black, as they often are in the Arab world. And he went into the Wedgwood dining room, and his slaves went with him to eat with him on the same table. I mean, we have, for the last 50 years, been doing business in the Gulf. When you go to eat with the sheikh, you eat on the floor, and all they're called mutarzis over there, not slaves. They eat on the floor out of the same dishes for a sheikh. So when he went to this restaurant, the management of the hotel asked him, can you please ask this man to leave? Slaves are not allowed in this, not slaves, black people are not allowed in this dining room. He said, look, he eats with me. And if you want him to leave, I will leave. So it's a whole different attitude to what a slave is or was.
Right. I think if we look at the slaves, you have a very, tradition in Islam of these slaves going up, but I think we can go back to Hazrat Bilal and so on and so forth. So there was no difference between at that time. But the slaves were also imported very often in the Islamic societies to protect the Khalifa or the king or whoever it was from his own people. So you had the Praetorian Guard around these people, and they served a particular purpose.
Yes, but those Praetorian Guards tended to be Turks rather than Africans. People from the steppes, the mercenaries around the Ottomans, they were from Turkestan. You take the Mamluks in Egypt, they were Turks. So for fighting, I think that the people of the steppes, the Turks, Mongols, Turks, they tended to be prized more for their fighting abilities.
Okay. So one thing, I'm sorry. Some thought came to my mind. Thank you, Gilo, for taking it away. I was wondering that there is one missing link in the values that you have ascribed. And that missing link I forget now, but I'll come back to it later on.
Morality.
Okay.
You know, before the Prophet, you were in it for what you could get. And it was considered normal to look after yourself, grab what money and assets and property you could, grab slaves, grab slave girls, kill your enemies, plot, deceive, lie. This new concept of morality, for instance, you take a guy like Hazrat Umar. He's Khalifa, he's sleeping like a beggar on the steps of the mosque in torn clothes. Why? You take someone like Salahuddin Ayyubi. When he became the Sultan of that part of the world, very powerful man, he inherited the 4,000-room palace of the last Fatimid Caliph. He said, I won't live there. He lived in a little house with 3-4 rooms. He inherited bags of jewelry. And what did he do? He bartered them. One particular emerald equal to 4 fingers and one ruby 2,400 carats. He just gave them away. Possessions meant nothing to him. The library of 1,20,000 books he gave to people who he thought would appreciate them. And when he died, admired, loved and all-powerful, there was not enough money in his personal accounts to pay for his funeral. So this new type of man who cared for something other than himself started emerging from the Islamic world. So this was the other quality which made a difference.
One more value, which is tolerance. This is a value which we have completely forgotten, unfortunately, today, here and abroad, by the way. It's not just a Pakistani melody. So how would you describe the fact that, how tolerant were these guys? I mean, I'm talking about not just the period of Muhammad in the beginning, but generally as you go down. Okay, I mean, let's see.
The problem is the chairs keep going down, then the mic gets stuck behind.
Okay, we'll try our best. Okay, all right, that's a good idea.
We'll manage.
Yes, tolerance, we were talking about tolerance.
You know, the Prophet believed in tolerance, and early Islam was reasonably tolerant. Then when you get to the great Islamic empires, Baghdad and Cordoba, they were extremely tolerant. I think that it started with tolerance being admired and respected. Along the way, it seems to have got lost. And I think that in today's world, part of this confusion arrives from various sentences in the Quran which seem to contradict each other. I have covered this later in the book in today's issues, but basically the tone of the Quranic verses is very different in the early Makkah verses and different in the latter Medina verses. The Makkah verses are openly in support of tolerance. Some of the Medina verses say kill the non-believers. Now there's a lot of debate as to what exactly this means. Some people have said that where it says kill the non-believers, it's preceded with al. Al means a specific group of non-believers. In Arabic, al, as opposed to general. So there's been a lot of debate, very lot of debate. But those that advocate intolerance, those that say we are here to fight and kill all unbelievers, they say that the latter verses annul, abrogate the earlier verses. So don't think that the earlier verses still stand. They've been replaced by the latter. Those that believe that no, Islam is a peaceful religion and our job is only to wage war or jihad under certain very provocative circumstances. They say that Assalamu alaikum, this is not go and kill people. So there's a lot of debate, and I think without going too much into it,
Right.
but this is a very live and unclear subject even today.
So which brings me to the point that the spread of Islam was due to the sword or the message?
The Muslim empire was substantially created by the sword. The spread of Islam was not at all caused by the sword. Because when these soldiers went out to conquer other lands, you had the very strange thing that the masses in those lands, the peasants, the poor, the mass of people, welcomed the Muslims. Because the Muslims offered lower taxes, better justice, concern about you, whereas the traditional ruling elite were busy cowing and having a good time. And people were not that attached to them. So when these Muslims came in, the public very happily joined them if they could knock out the few hundred people which were at the heart of power in that territory. Public would go with it. So conquest was by the sword. But even among the Muslims, there was a bit of a... Muslims had a treasury. And part of the job of that treasury was to look after Muslims. So the more Muslims you had, the less money there was to go around. So a lot of the older Muslims didn't want too many new Muslims. Because if there was 1 million in the treasury, better to share it among us 1,000 people. Right. Rather than among 10,000 people, we'll end up with nothing. So they didn't go around trying to convert, unlike the Western missionaries, right, who were busy trying to convert. These Muslims, as they conquered, didn't. But the people said, look, if we become Muslims, there are benefits. Just like our Pakistanis I assume including you, go and settle down in America.
Hello?
Because it offers you more than this place does.
I've always said that I live in America, I'm not settled there.
Okay. But a lot of people became Muslims because they felt it was a better thing to be a Muslim. And there was nothing very difficult to digest in the Muslim religion because one God, follow justice. It was all, yeah, why not? So that's how they all started becoming Muslim.
And the role of the Sufis in spread of Islam in India, which is much...
That comes a little later, but you know, we've got very little time and a lot to say.
Oh.
I've tried to avoid religion. You know, I'm not really an expert on religion. I try to make this a book about people and how they lived and what they did.
Okay, I take your point. I think we are already 25 minutes left. So let me ask you, then what happened to change the balance between the Europeans and the Islamic empires?
Well, as the Muslims grew arrogant, lazy, more status, the West firstly developed navies. And they sailed out on these navies and found amazing things like gold in America. So just like oil has made the Arabs rich, at that time these navies made Europe a lot richer, particularly Spain and Portugal. Then they discovered new ways of organizing their business activities. Firstly, banking. Now, the Muslims had a thing against banking because riba, whatever it means, whether it's usury or whether it's just lending money, there's a difference. But the Muslims did not develop banking. The Jews and the Christians developed banking. And as wars grew longer, rulers needed financing from banks. Particularly, you take a famous name like the Rothschilds in Europe. If you didn't have good bankers, you couldn't fight long wars. If you didn't have good bankers, you couldn't finance greater expeditions and achievements. So banking came up there, not here. And then they discovered a new way of doing business and called it the joint stock company. The Muslims followed proprietorship, partnership. Now, if you and I have a partnership and I die, the business is closed down. Hisab is done to make sure there's no crookery, but that business is finished. In the West, the joint stock company never died, so that more and money could be put into it, its vision could be made greater, and finally you reach this famous joint stock company, the East India Company, which controlled 25% of the world's economy at a time when Britain's economy was 3% of the world's economy. So the joint stock company and banking started making these countries much more powerful, much wealthier. I mean, if you remember, India, with which we're all more familiar, the Mughals were not initially conquered by the by the government. They were manipulated by the East India Company, and only after the 1857 mutiny did the government of the West, of Britain, say, now enough is enough, now we are in control of India. Openly. So I think that these things started to happen, the West started to come up, and look at the amazing attitude of the Muslims. I mean, there was still much going on. You take the steam engine. I mean, we are all led to believe that the great industrial revolution was created by the steam engine in Europe, Watson, the steam engine.
Right.
But actually, a couple of 100 years before that, I think maybe 300 years before that, in the Ottoman territory, they discovered and invented a steam engine. Except what did they use it for? Not for creating an industrial revolution. They wanted that their roast mutton be cooked better. So the steam engine would turn the mutton perfectly, so no part would get overcooked and no undercooked. So that was the only use they had of the steam engine. So it was the attitudes and the new approaches to things that took the West up. And lastly, most important of all, what took the West up was the Maxim gun.
Yeah.
And their famous poet wrote this little ditty which explained the West's rise and the fall of the East. Whatever happens, we have got. The Maxim got, and they have not.
Right. So in a way, the search for knowledge, which it seems to me during the earlier period, focused on medicine, thought, mathematics, algebra, insofar as the Islamic empires is concerned. So the Western societies then inherited all these things, and their search for knowledge moved them towards weaponry and other industrial usages, notwithstanding the steam engine. So the direction was completely different, and we didn't do any of those things. So by the time that power balance had completely shifted, in military terms.
Yes, I agree with that.
So, I think when I read this book, my first reaction was that it's so easy to read. There is no silsila. It is not necessary for you to read one chapter after the other chapter. And you can open the book anywhere and complete that thought process or thinking process. So that is one feature that I enjoyed it very much, because I was a little concerned looking at the size of the book. But then eventually it turned out. So what do you think is the value of the book? Because we are going to recommend everybody to go and get one copy immediately after this.
I think the first and most important thing is that it's fun to read. I think that if it's not enjoyable, you shouldn't waste your time reading it.
Right.
Now, what do I mean fun to read? You've all heard of Harun al-Rashid, you've all heard of the Abbasids, but in fact, many of you must have heard of the Barmakids, the family which was the most powerful in the land for 2-3 generations in the time of the Abbasids. The Barmakids were prime ministers, they were rulers, they were very powerful, very rich people. And Jafar the Barmakid was the best friend of Harun al-Rashid. So in the evening, there was nothing that Harun liked better than sitting and having a drink. They did drink in those days.
Yeah.
With Jafar and with his sister Abbasa. Harun's sister Abbasa was his favorite. So the three of them would spend the evening together drinking, talking, laughing. But it was creating a problem. Abbasa was a royal princess. She shouldn't sit openly in the evenings with a guy who is not from her family and she's not married. So Harun came up with a very good idea. He said, let's go through what looks like a marriage. So publicly, Abbasa and Jafar were married. And they were not married in the sense that they were not allowed to go to bed together, but they could sit and spend the evening with the brother, the ruler, together. And this was working fine until they fell in love with each other. And the next thing you know is they had a child. And when Harun heard this, he was livid. He had the child killed, he had Jafar killed, he had his sister Abbasa killed. And he had every Barmakid locked up in jail till they remained there till they died.
As justice?
Well, by then justice was a little tarnished.
Yeah.
But I think that, the book is full of stories like this.
Right.
And I think you'll enjoy reading these stories.
Certainly. Now, before we move on to another area of discussion, which is, I would like you to talk about some of the personalities, focus on personalities, incidents, and the country situations which you have. For example, you talk a lot about Libya in the book, you talk about Saladin. So I was wondering if we can pick some areas of your choice and enlighten us. But I do want you to tell us the story about Omar Khayyam, the fact that we all know him because of the cup of wine, but we have forgotten his mathematical inventions.
I would love to tell you a little about that. 2 lines before we get to that.
Okay.
The last reason why I strongly recommend this book to you is, we all try to improve our lives by hard work, various other things we do. But I found that the biggest crashes I've had in my life are not because I didn't work hard, but because I made wrong decisions. And I think that this book,
We are not going to talk about his wrong decisions.
this book shows you how great men, much greater than you or I, how they made decisions, the type of decisions they made, the type of advice they gave. And I just give you three little quotes which show you things, the type of thing. I mean, for instance, you're talking fat book. The first fat book I read, which was almost as fat as this was The Godfather. And I will never forget, make them an offer they can't refuse.
They can't refuse.
There are things you learn from The Godfather which you change your life. Many of you have children, and you know what problems children are. They won't do what you want, they want to do what you don't want. And Hazrat Ali advised, do not raise your children the way your parents raised you. They were born for a different time. Now, this one line, if you absorb it, it can change your entire relationship with your children. What you want from them and what you expect from them will change. You take another sentence of Hazrat Ali. Avarice dulls the faculties of judgment and wisdom. Too much has been made of greed is good in America and Wall Street. Greed is not good. It makes you do things which are not great things. And I think, though he was not a Muslim, but he plays an important part in this book, the great Genghis Khan, the greatest conqueror the world has ever seen. I think that he learnt at an early age how to judge men, how to keep them loyal to him. His ability to make people loyal to him was unbelievable. But even he said, too much cannot be expected from most men, and loyalty has its limits. Now, one sentence like that, when your dear and near person or great friend or assistant is disloyal to you and lets you down, should you become his enemy till death? Or should you realize he's a man? It is in the nature of mankind to be less than perfect. Learn to forgive it and take what is left that is good and build on it. So there is so much wisdom of these people, and I think that is a very important reason for people to read this book.
On a lighter note, you mentioned that Genghis Khan was not a Muslim, which is correct. But he did send out some emissaries to Baghdad to learn, because he was trying to accumulate knowledge from various places about their tradition and religion, etc. So the emissaries that arrived in Baghdad went and met with the council of ulama, and they said, we have come from and we would like to know the specific values of Islam so that we can carry it back. But there's one condition. We live in a very cold climate. We should be allowed to drink. So as the story goes, all night the ulama debated this over wine. And in the morning they said no. So there you have it.
But I think that,
I hope Bordeaux.
Genghis Khan discouraged alcohol. In fact, his command was, drinking is not good for you, and you should not be allowed to drink more than 3 times a month.
15 minutes. We can deal with it. Yeah, thank you. All right. So I think we were at a point of looking at some of the personalities that in the course of your research work you have come to appreciate much better. And so please.
To sort of go quickly to meet our time fund.
I mean, that's
I give you a few little personal things about some of the people I think were the greatest of all.
Okay.
These. You take Khalid bin Walid, the sword of Allah. I would say he was probably the 3rd greatest general in history. But when his friend Amr bin As was asked, what is so special about Khalid? He came out with these beautiful 2 lines to describe Khalid. He said, he is a master of war, a friend of death. He has the dash of a lion and the patience of a cat. So this is what made him such an amazing leader in battle. And his famous remark that when he would come to conquer a new people, he would tell them, I give you the last chance to surrender. You can either surrender or accept the taxes. For I bring with me the men who desire death as ardently as you desire life. This was the difference between the Muslim soldier and all other soldiers. Okay, they desire death as ardently as the other man desires life. How could you beat them? And he was an arrogant man, Khalid bin Walid. You know, he was a fighter. He was not a politician. And when he beat Heraclius and slaughtered his army, Heraclius sent him a message. You have killed my son-in-law and captured my daughter. I now ask you for my daughter back. Either return her to me on payment of a ransom or give her to me as a gift, for honor is a strong element in your character. Khalid replied, take her as a gift, there shall be no ransom. So you know the attitude that I can conquer everyone, but I don't need it. So he was a very exciting man.
Magnanimity and greatness. Huh?
But I know we're short of time. But after conquering everybody,
you can't get to the end so quickly.
After conquering all the enemies, Abu Bakr's life ended and Umar took over. The first thing Umar did was sack him from being the top general. Now, isn't this strange? A guy who's just conquered everybody in sight, you sack him? And the answer which Umar gave was people had started to believe that they could only win with Khalid leading them. They must realize that it is God who leads them to victory. Now, that was the official reason given. But was it the real reason? Much before that, 20 years before that, Hazrat Umar, as a young man, was famous as a wrestler. And like you had the Olympics, every year in Makkah you had the games. And the champion wrestler was the great hero of the day. So when Umar came into the ring, the betting was all on him, that he's unbeatable. But this younger guy who was not as big as Umar, not as tough as Umar, challenged him. And they said, go. And these two men went at each other. And within 2 minutes, there was a crack noise. This man had thrown Umar with a special throw, and Umar's leg cracked and broke. And Umar walked with a limp the rest of his life. Who was that young man? Khalid bin Walid. So it does influence your judgment a little bit, but I won't go as far as saying it was the reason. But let us move beyond him. Umar Khayyam. I think that we all know him as a poet, but he was a much greater mathematician than he was a poet. And at that time, he worked out the number of days in a year. And Umar Khayyam showed the days at 365.24219,858. Today, with the Hubble telescope and all the modern techniques and computers, it is 365.242,190. So without an instrument, just using calculation, he calculated this. But I think he's not famous for this calculation. He's famous for writing the moving finger rights and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety, nor wit can cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it.
Or about the cup of wine business, which is very appealing.
So Umar was a fabulous guy, but Saladin, who came next, was even more fabulous.
Yes.
I think one of the greatest of the Muslim Leaguers, strange man, a bad general, no particular ambition, didn't want anything. How did he get to power? And what did he do with it? As a young man, he was taken by his uncle, the great General Shaukat, into Egypt to deal with the Egyptian Fatimid caliphs. And Shirko killed the prime minister of the Fatimids, and in celebration ate too much and died 2 months later. The Fatimid ruler Al-Adid died shortly after, within a few days. The boss of them all, Sultan Nurdin, died within a month. And the Christian enemy, Alamrik, who was the top Christian, died. So the 5 guys who controlled that world all died, leaving Saladin, who was a sweet young guy, maybe possibly someone like Qazi at the time, or Razi, you know. And he was lifted to the chair, maybe because he didn't seem like a threat to anyone. Having got it, he ruled with only one ambition: I must take Jerusalem. And finally he did. And I think many of you would have seen that movie with
Kingdom of Heaven.
Kingdom of Heaven, how Balian. And Balian said after Jerusalem was taken, he says, when the Christians conquered Jerusalem, they slaughtered every last Muslim. Why are you doing different? Saladin replied, I am not of those men, I am Saladin. And how he treated them was amazing. He said that everyone could go on payment of a small amount, 10 dirham, 5 dirham, 1 dirham. And a lot of people said, we don't even have 1 dirham. He said, I will pay the money for those who cannot pay. So he was an amazing man, but he had one problem, big problem in his life, that having been responsible for the end of the Fatimid dynasty, all the Ismailis, Fatimid was an Ismaili dynasty, went for him. And the assassins decided to kill him. And 3 attempts were made where they tried to kill him. One marched into his tent and stabbed him, but he was wearing chain mail, so he survived. The man was killed. One jumped off a tree onto a horse, but missed him and fell off, and he was killed. So Saladin was a guy who had a real problem. Finally, he took to not just wearing mail, but sleeping in a high up, you had to climb a ladder to his bed. Now one day, he got a message that the emissary of the top assassin leader wanted to talk to him. So he said, come. So he prepared his team to protect him. The emissary said, no, get rid of them all. So he kept 2 men back and got rid of all the other guards. So when the emissary came in, he says, why don't you send these away also? Saladin replied, I regard these 2 as my own sons. They and I are as one. The messenger turned to the Mamluks, his guards, and said, if I ordered you in the name of my master to kill this sultan, would you do so? They drew their swords, saying, command us as you wish. The messenger left, taking the 2 with him, and Saladin inclined to make peace with them, and God knows best. So then Saladin stopped, he forgave them, they were given amnesty, and he could get on with Jerusalem, which he then took. And one of his big enemies there was Richard the Lionheart.
Right.
And you all know the stories of how he gave ice to Richard when he had fever, when he gave him a horse, when Richard's horse was killed in battle. And finally, Richard tried to negotiate and offered his sister Joanne as a bride to Saladin's brother, saying that then when they are married, Christians and Muslims can share Jerusalem. But it was not done, and Saladin took Jerusalem.
Did not work out, yeah.
And it all ended. And Richard never made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and Saladin never made the pilgrimage to Mecca. But this story is a beautiful story.
Indeed, he's an extraordinary man. I don't know how much time we had left, but I do want to bring you to modern times. Of course, there are a couple of leaders that I'd like you to talk about, but I'd like to start with Sukarno in Indonesia. We know so little about that, or we have not followed that as closely as we would. And somehow or the other, our impressions are very sketchy about what happened with Sukarno and Suharto and the massive killings that took place.
Sukarno was an exciting man, but if I could be permitted to just say one quote of another great man, Muhammad Ali Pasha of Egypt, which built modern Egypt.
Okay.
He was a very cunning man, very capable man. And someone read him out 40 pages of Machiavelli's The Prince. After hearing it, he replied, I can learn nothing from this man. As regards cunning, I know far more about it than he does. So, but coming to Sukarno, Sukarno and Suharto, they're almost like two sides of the same coin. According to the people of the East, Sukarno was the great man. According to the people of the West, Suharto was the great man. Sukarno fought, won independence, united Indonesia, united 14,000 islands into one language, one country. And when finally in 1945, they said we need to have a president in the meeting of the top guys, they said, what about Sukarno? What do you say? So Sukarno says, okay, I'm ready. And at the end of the meeting, having been appointed president, he walked home. On the way, stopped at a street merchant, bought some chicken satay home to take home for his dinner, for his wife and kids, and became president. A guy who made no money, a guy who wanted no glory. He had only one, if you want to call it a vice, it was a vice, but it was one personal interest other than saving his country. And that was women. He was a great ladies'
Passion,
man.
not vice.
Huh?
Passion, not vice.
And Bhutto learnt a lot about women from Sukarno. But
Oh.
when the picture of Sukarno in the book shows him with Marilyn Monroe.
That's right.
And when he went to America, American TV interviewed him and said, what is the difference between politics in America and politics in Indonesia? He says, very different. Your politicians kiss the babies and shake hands with the mothers. The Sukarno way is to kiss the mothers and shake hands with the babies. So he was a guy who was into building a nation, but then Suharto, who was the general, decided to make his move. And 6 generals were slaughtered in what was known as the Night of the Long Knives, or the Night of the Generals, and a massacre started, prompted by the CIA, but also led by the Indonesian army. And that massacre, 1965, some say 1 million people were killed. What type of people? Followers of Sukarno, Chinese, there are a lot of Chinese, and communists, because under Sukarno, you had the biggest the biggest communist party outside China, 3 million members. So America wanted to get rid of him. And the CIA provoked this whole thing. And I think the story of a massacre of almost 1 million people, and how it was handled, and how America said nothing better, no better news could have been given than the fall of Sukarno and now the arrival of Suharto. And Suharto died some years later, the 6th richest guy in the world, having made $20 billion, and messed up Indonesia completely.
I know there's a lot of stuff there, and I would have loved to continue, but I think we've done our time. I don't know whether there is one question I want to ask you. If you were to recommend one book today, not your own, not written by you, which would that be? A book of modern, to
Any
understand.
book about anything?
Anything.
I would say The Godfather.
नहीं, Godfather तो हमने सबने पढ़ लिया ना, फिल्म भी देख ली है.
The books that have made a difference to my life. From China, the selected works of Mao.
Okay.
The Art of War by Sun Tzu.
Yeah.
The Tao by Lao Tzu. From India, as a young man, I was much affected by Gandhi's My Experiments with Truth.
Yes.
I would say that from Pakistan, no particular book.
Okay.
But I think from America...
No, now we have one.
Huh?
We have one.
Well, this is not a great book.
Ali, thank you. So you are taking my time now by interfering. Thank you very much, everybody, for being here. I hope the sound system worked for all of you. Do we have 10 minutes? Okay, all right.
If we have 10 minutes,
So
two people I would like to say a few
if
words.
we have 10 minutes, then let's proceed. We want to talk about two people that Ali wants to talk about. Let's go.
One is Gaddafi,
Yes.
who I think was, personally, he was one of my heroes when I was a young man. I think that his death was tragic. But when he died, President Reagan had called him the mad dog of the Middle East. Nelson Mandela had called him one of the great revolutionary icons of our time. Now, I don't know, you may prefer Reagan's judgment of him, you may prefer Mandela's judgment of him. Was he a good man or a bad man? Let's look at some of what he did while he was in charge for those 40-odd years. Free electricity for every Libyan. All bank loans to Libyans, 0% interest. Homes are a human right. His parents would not be given a house till every Libyan had a home. All newlyweds would receive a gift from the state of $50,000. Free medical for everyone. Free education for everyone. When you buy a new car, the government will pay 50% of the cost to make it easier for you. The petrol price per litre, 14 cents. Libya had no debt when he left, and its frozen asset reserves were $150 billion cash. They gave a salary, the Libyan government gave a salary to any jobless graduate. A part of the oil revenues were deposited in the personal bank account of every citizen in Libya. 40 loaves of bread cost 15 cents. 25% of all Libyans had a university degree. Now that is what he did. Did he deserve to be sodomized and killed the way he was? And there's a picture of him lying dead in this book. He was an austere, religious, eccentric man. And after his revolution, the first thing he did was send someone to Nasser saying, we are ready to step down and we want you to lead our country. You are our hero. Haikal, the journalist who got Nasser sent to investigate, sent a telegram back to Nasser. They are shockingly innocent and scandalously pure. Gaddafi, as president, had no chauffeur, no facilities. His lifetime was austere. His lifestyle was austere. But the world went for him. He was a supporter of not just Mandela, but of many revolutionary groups. But to the West, his greatest crime was raising the price of oil, taxing Western oil companies, nationalizing BP, petroleum, and taking over 51% of all foreign oil companies. They went for him because of what he was doing. And they charged him with Lockerbie. And Libya was made a pariah of the world community. They couldn't sell their oil, nobody would deal with them. And what was the reason given? That the Libyans killed 100 or 250 people in the Lockerbie air crash.
Yeah.
But did he kill them? In March 2014, Al Jazeera exposed the truth about Lockerbie. And Libya, to rejoin the world community, Gaddafi was forced to pay $10 million compensation to each of the people killed. That is $1.5 billion compensation he paid to open the door to let Libya back into the world community. But it was later shown that Mezbani, an Irani intelligence officer who was defected, had confirmed what US intelligence had always known, that the Libyans were innocent and the bombing was done by Iran in retaliation for the downing of their passenger flights by US Vensines, in which 280 Iranis were killed. Great. So, despite the fact that America knew that Gaddafi was innocent of this, So I think that
I think we better stop. These are tremendous stories. Thank you very much, Ravi. Thank you. So now we'll have some copies of this book at the book hall, or whatever it is called.